welcome to everyone. My name's Lucia Heath. I'm the CEO of Women for Election. I would like to welcome you and also pay my respects to elders. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and to future leaders emerging as well. I'd also like to say that sovereignty of this land was never ceded, and it's my belief that until we reach treaty with First Nations people in Australia, then our ability to move forward together in harmony is compromised. And I think it's worth noting that I feel like we've made a bit of progress in that front in the last few weeks as well. So been very happy to see progress in terms of the Uluru Statement of the Heart. A big welcome to our guest today, Emily Wilding. Emily, thank you for joining us so much. These sessions, we deliberately keep them casual and conversational. Please put your questions in the chat as we go, or if you'd like to acknowledge which lands you're joining us from, please feel free to do that as well. But Emily, I'll ask you to take yourself off mic. I've got a lot that I want to ask you, but I'm not going to hog the mic the entire time. And in particular, look, before we get to your elected career, I'd just like to ask you a couple of questions in regards to, what you were doing before you decided to run. Had you always been political? Had you had any involvement with any political office before? What was it that made you want to get involved and get elected?
Yeah, thank you. If you hear any tippy tapping in the background, I've got a very needy Cocker Spaniel who's just realised I'm on a video call and would love to be a part of it.
This is an easy zone in that respect. I could have kids through the door at any moment.
So look, growing up, very little interest in politics, to be honest. So my background is in community services, it's in youth work. So mostly doing that work out for more not-for-profits. And I guess that first intersection with politics was really trying to lobby local governments in the areas I was working, because there was these massive gaps in service, and there would be gaps in state funding, there'd be gaps in federal funding, but on the ground, you'd be like, well, there's obviously a need, something needs to happen in this space. So it made sense to go to the branch of government that was closest to the ground and say, hey, this is something we need, which in that scenario was actually services for LGBTI young people. It was out in Midland in Western Australia, and it's quite a rough and tumble place, and there was no real place for young people to go from that demographic if they needed support. So sort of got more involved in that process through that. Sort of became more involved in, local government actually existed to me, which was new. Up until that point, I just sort of thought fairies collected the bins and that's how the world worked. But and then I was very fortunate that the Bassendean Council in 2017, in response to the postal survey on marriage equality, raised the rainbow flag outside the town as a response. And I would have been 24, 23 at the time, went down, checked it out, was chatting to some of the councillors there, and they said, hey, join a committee, get involved. And through that sort of started to develop that understanding of what local government actually was and what it could do. And then, realised that there was a whole world that I'd been completely unaware of up to that point.
Yeah, fabulous. Yes, we just finished a tour, Ruth and I, around Victorian government, talking exactly about what you can do at local government, because there's this illusion that it's roads, rates and rubbish, and it is so much more than that. And you've just talked about something in terms of practical that you were lobbying and that got affected change at the local government level as well. Okay, so you've had your first exposure to local government. Then you've decided to run. You probably haven't necessarily told a lot of people, if anyone, at that stage. So what was it? What were the first steps that you started to take? Did you approach local councillors? Were you a member of a party? How did you? It's very opaque. So how did you take those first steps?
Yeah, so I suppose I was very fortunate because I was in that committee already. I'd had some interactions with councillors and had some people I could sort of go to and say, hey, what's the deal with this, which is really helpful because it's very sort of opaque when you're looking in from the outside. And that was fantastic. But I suppose in considering sort of those first steps for running, I think a lot of it was around safety and how to run, what that would mean from a safety perspective in terms of because in WA, you know, you need to put your an address down to authorize, and it can't be a PO box. So basically, that leaves you with just your residential address. And you know, when I first ran in 2019, I was 25. So as a 25-year-old trans woman, putting my address out to the electorate, but also because of the nature of the modern world, to the whole internet was a massive consideration.
Yeah.
And to the point where I actually asked a friend if he could authorize it instead, because that just felt, you know, significantly safer. And then it was, you know, assessing the time commitments, what I'd actually want to, what I'd actually do if I got elected as well. That was a very big thing, sorry. And yeah, just sort of trying to understand the process, going to meetings, trying to get across as much as possible before sort of putting my hat in the ring.
And so when you ran, Emily, did you run with a party, or had you been a party member, or had you had a profile in your neck of the woods?
Yeah, so not really, no. So WA is very fortunate in that we don't have quite an entrenched party system in our local government. It's very much just individuals from the community. So I didn't need the backing of a party or anything like that. And I wasn't a member of a political party at that point either. It was just me as a random person in the community thinking, yeah, you know, this would be great to do. And very, very little profile. I'd only moved into the area a couple of years before that. So, and decided very quickly that I absolutely loved it and wanted to contribute. But outside of being present on the committee and that sort of stuff, no, not really much of a profile at all.
Okay. Yeah, I think New South Wales aside, most states in terms of local government, most councillors run as independents. There's no party affiliation. And I noted what you said about having to put your address down as a candidate. Now that is something that Victoria has changed, but it is still present in other states. And it is a barrier. It is a barrier for people to run. And there's many of us who are, you know, campaigning to get that changed. And there's reviews happening currently. At least I know there is in New South Wales. There was a cultural review that was completed in WA and Victoria. But it's interesting, you know, as a trans woman, and you and I have talked before this, you're alumni from our courses as well. You know, visibility, well, representation is obviously very important to you, but there is no openly trans politicians at the federal or state or territory level in Australia currently.
Yeah.
We at the local government level, I think you made note that your investigations found somebody in Kalgoorlie 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And apart from that, where is that visibility that you see in the political sense?
Apart from that, there's not really any, to be honest. So I think in terms of even candidates who are put up for election on a federal and a state level, I think the Greens put forward quite a few gender diverse candidates, trans and non-binary people, but they're pretty much the only party that really puts forward people from that demographic. I think outside of that, there's very little representation, and part of that is because that representation is a double-edged sword, right? So when you put yourself out, you want to represent it, and you want to say, hey, look, you know, there's people from this background and we're doing these things. But also when you're one of a very few people who are actually in that background, and sometimes you have political rhetoric which is particularly negative towards who you are as a person and your background and your demographic, putting yourself out there as that example of representation can be quite a risky thing. And I think, you know, in looking at other local government councillors who are trans as well, I've got no doubt that there are other people, but from what I can tell, they've all decided to keep a very low profile for that sort of sense of safety and not wanting to draw attention to themselves, because obviously that does have the potential for some really negative and unwarranted backlash.
Yeah, look, I think we all have sympathy for that, and Women for Election helped a trans woman in Hasluck, up in the federal state of Hasluck, run, Janine Williams, and she did fantastically well for her first campaign, and contributed to an extraordinary swing in that electorate as well. And we want to play a greater role in assisting gender diverse and non-binary trans women to run as well. And we totally applaud your courage at running, and also providing platforms like this, because that is very important. And we already know trans women running in the Victorian and South Australian, so Victorian state election and South Australian local government elections. So the candidate numbers are increasing, and I think that's important, and we celebrate that totally. Now back to your career in local government. We find we're all massively informed on the negatives of going into politics, Emily, but don't hear enough about the positive impact that we can have by being elected and being at that decision-making table. Share with us some. I mean, you've only been elected for circa 8 months, but tell us some things you've already managed to achieve for your community by being elected.
Yeah, look, so the first 8 months are very much a bit of a whirlwind. Yes, it's a very steep learning curve, and from a community services youth work background, there was a huge amount of things that I remember sitting in the first meeting and thinking, what on earth is an R code? What do I do with this? I've got to find this out now. And, that's probably the story of the first six months. But now that it's settled a bit more and I've sort of got my feet on the ground, I was able to get through a motion a couple of months ago around funding and the development of like a project proposal for outreach youth services in one of our sort of outer suburbs. So we currently deliver stuff in our town centre, but modern youth services are sort of reaching out more and trying to sort of not just rely on young people coming to those services, but actually going out to where they are and trying to engage them there. So we'll be doing some stuff in that space next year, which is very, very exciting. That's probably the most tangible win so far. But definitely, I think, I feel that being in that room and having a slightly different perspective to a lot of other people who go into local government. So with that community background, with a bit of a younger sort of perspective, with a real focus on access and inclusion, that there's been some that's shaped a lot of the decision making which is happening so far. And then going into July and going into August, which is Homelessness Week, looking at sort of putting some stuff together to look at how, as a local government, we can sort of help to coordinate state resources to respond to that issue here in WA, because all around the country, it's a growing problem. It's been a problem for quite a while, and it's only going to get worse as housing is less affordable and less available. So looking at how we can do stuff in that space as well.
Thanks, Emily. You've brought up an interesting point. Again, at the local government level is where homelessness services are dealt with at the coalface at a greater level than state government, and a lot of our alumni are very passionate on that issue. In fact, it's that issue that is driving them at the moment to consider getting elected. So it doesn't surprise me that that's a focus in the coming months for you as well. So in terms of being an elected councillor now, are there doors that have opened to you through being an elected member of the community that may not have opened otherwise? Give us some insight in that respect.
So not too many specific doors, but I guess the biggest thing for me is being able to sort of see behind the curtain in terms of how these decisions are made and what goes into those decisions, and just that whole process, that whole thing in politics of how the sausage is made, and that's a completely different thing than you get to see from the outside. And I think as a councillor, it's been a real privilege to get to see so much of the work which is done in our community that people are often aware of in their little pockets, but when you get to see it on like a broad sort of town-wide scale and say, oh wow, we're doing amazing things here, we're doing amazing things there, getting invited into these spaces to actually see this stuff in action, it's just incredible. You don't necessarily have an appreciation of just how much is community driven and how much people really do contribute and care for their communities until you can sort of have it laid out for you like you often get as a councillor. So that's been an absolute privilege and a really fantastic part since being elected.
Fabulous. I find, again, feedback from our alumni that say I had no idea what was going in my community until I was elected, and it keeps them inspired to keep running as well. So I'm glad to hear that that's been the same experience for you. In terms of, in relation to trans women entering politics, how can we as a community do better to encourage more trans women and non-binary folk to consider seeing themselves as future political leaders?
Yeah, well, that's a very big question, and there's probably a million little things that could contribute. But I suppose the main ones, to my mind, would be calling out a lot of that really negative rhetoric. I think we saw in the federal election, trans people as a political football. And for most people, when you're being used as the ball, you don't even consider being one of the players. It's you're already so far down that ladder. But if we do want to call that stuff out and say it's not acceptable, it's not appropriate. And I think, we saw in the federal election result that on a community level, on a society level, we did reject a lot of those ideas, which is very reassuring, I think, for a lot of people, myself included. I think we need to do more to support gender diverse people, trans and non-binary people to run, people who might not have actually thought about it. They're active in their community, they're doing things, but, saying, hey, have you ever thought about running? Because a lot of people, if you haven't seen yourself represented in those spaces, it might not even cross your mind. It might not, until in Bassendean, until I'd seen that rainbow flag raised and actually saw that local government was a space where I was welcomed and invited. It just hadn't even crossed my mind that I might go into those spaces. And even when going to the candidate info sessions, which was sort of a sea of middle-aged balding white men, and you're sort of sitting there in your seat listening to the information and you think, oh my God, like I don't belong here. No one here is like me. And helping people get over that initial hurdle is really important. I think if you're in a political party, really pushing for pre-selection of trans and gender diverse and non-binary people in those pre-selections. And it's the same thing a lot of cis people face as well, cis women, where even when you do get pre-selected, it's often in unwinnable seats, and the safe seats are for the boys kind of thing. And I think challenging that notion as well, and really pushing, because there should be value in having more diverse parliamentarians in and of itself. And if that's a true goal of any party, they should be making sure that happens through the allocation of winnable seats and grassroots people into those seats. And I think, conversations like this, opportunities like this, the opportunity to just sort of spotlight where it is happening and where that representation is happening. I know for me, a big part of feeling like I could run was seeing a trans delegate in West Virginia in America, Danica Rowan, and she was elected. She was the first trans person elected to any legislature in America. And that was the first moment I was like, oh, wow, that's a thing, right? And it was someone who wasn't elected. Her gender identity was almost irrelevant. She was intensely interested in roads and fixing congestion and sorting out her community. And she was elected for those reasons. And it also happened to be trans. And it was this really great story of what you can do and how gender identity doesn't have to be a barrier in that space. So I think focusing on that representation is also a really, really important part of that process.
I think those were all fabulously said, Emily. Thank you. Just absolutely wonderful. And you've inspired some questions coming through in the chat related to that as well. I'm going to go to Chloe first. Chloe, I'm happy to ask it for you, or you're welcome to take yourself off mic. You happy?
Yeah, I can ask it.
Yep.
I was curious about sort of any trans specific responses that you got during your campaign and while being in office? Has anyone made you being trans a thing during that process? How did you kind of deal with that? I'm a bit hesitant with regards to that.
Yeah, look, fair enough. And it's a really good question. When I ran twice and I didn't get elected the first time, I got elected the second. And when I ran the first time, I spent the entire couple months period just bracing myself for it, right? I was convinced any day now I was going to get some horrible comment, or it would be on the local Facebook page. That'd be the controversy of who this candidate was. And none of it came. There was absolutely nothing transphobic at all, which was a really pleasant surprise and really reassuring. And the first campaign was so free of any of that negative stuff that when I ran the second time, I actually did feel comfortable to use my own address to authorize my materials, because it just didn't seem like a thing that was going to come up. And again, since being elected, you brace yourself, you think, oh, well, this is where it's going to happen. This is where, now that I'm actually more visible, it's going to come, but it's been 8 months and absolutely nothing. So I think
Amazing.
we often we hear these really loud, really vocal, very nasty voices, and we think this must be everyone. And then you actually go out into the community and you think, oh no, most people are indifferent, it's good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chloe. I hope that's helped get your shoulders back a little bit. It's interesting, Emily, and I fully appreciate that you and I are in different boats in that capacity, but all the advice I was given was, don't run this year. When I ran, don't run. All this terrible stuff's going to happen to you, and none of it did. And it was that kind of moment that made me move to what I'm doing now, because I think in part, and again, I do not want to underplay at all the concerns that trans women, trans men may have when they run, but the narrative of don't do it, it's toxic, is there in part to keep us out. And the more positive experiences that we hear that this didn't happen to me, the more that people go, actually, maybe I can give it a go. So thank you for the question, Chloe. There is another question here from Tessa. Tessa sent me a private message saying she's sick, so can I ask it for her? What was campaigning like? What surprised you and what challenged you? Now you've did it twice, so.
What challenged me, I'll start with that first. The idea of, putting yourself out there is always challenging, and it takes a certain pushing through that discomfort of actually being like, no, like I am someone who is worth voting for, you should vote for me. I think a lot of us have this instinct when we go like, oh, I don't want to do that. I sound really, self-centered or narcissistic or whatever, but like, you have to have that confidence in yourself that you do have something to contribute and push through some of that discomfort. And even down to putting your face on flyers and stuff and printing 10,000 of them, and you think, oh my god, what is this? What surprised me was just how much was happening in the community, and running for election was a real impetus to see what was happening and to get involved in different spaces. And as a result, I've stayed active in some community organizations that do really amazing work in our town, because I sort of saw what they were doing and I was like, wow, this is really, really great. And I had no idea. It was just completely off my radar. It was a challenge, but I think campaigning is a challenge for everyone, especially Sebastian Dean's luckily not super massive. We were able to letterbox it with a handful of volunteers and a couple of weeks, which is great. I was surprised by how inexpensive it could be. So we probably spent $1,000 running, and that was almost all on flyers and a tiny bit on like Facebook adverts. But it looks like this massive, daunting process. But once you get into it, you actually realize it's quite achievable, which is really good.
Thank you for the question, Tessa. Yeah, I think the campaigning piece, as you saw in our equip training too, Emily, I think it's opaque. How would you campaign? Secret party business, secret men's business, and we make it transparent. And the more transparent it is, the more likely that people are to step into it. And we can break down the getting your face on the flyers thing and what's the cost into quite easy to understand to-do list. The hardest part of any campaign is admitting you want to run and taking that first step. That is the hardest part of any campaign. Hey, Chloe, I saw you laugh then. The rest is just a to-do list.
Yeah, I think the other surprising bit as well is it wasn't, I was surprised by how cheap it could be, but I was surprised by how little impact money spent actually had on the final vote. Like I think you see people, and in one of our elections, there were some people who had just signs everywhere, like everywhere you could possibly look, there'd be a call flute. And during the campaign, you're driving around and you're thinking, oh my God, they've got signs. I haven't got signs, and their signs are everywhere. And you sort of, in your head, you conflate more money spent with more votes and a high chance of winning. But that just didn't seem to be the case. It was more about what you were doing on the ground and sort of conversations you were having with people and how you came across than it was if you could afford 10 signs or 1,000 signs.
I've got one last question for you, Emily. Then if anyone else has got questions, please put them in the chat, or we're a smaller group, we can take yourself off mic as well. Dare I ask, you're experiencing life as a councillor now, maybe you'll want to do a couple of terms as a councillor. Can you see potential for you running at a state or federal level in the future at some stage?
Yeah, look, if the opportunity came up, I'd certainly take it. I think there's an opportunity there to increase that representation of trans people in our state and federal systems, and any opportunity to advance that would be excellent. But at the same time, I'm in this because I actually really care about community. And it's not for the purpose of chasing a political career. Like if I was to run for state or federal parliament, I'd want it to be for where I am now. And I wouldn't want to sort of chase vacant seats. I'd want it to sort of be an extension of the work I've already done in my community and have it sort of an organic thing that continues from that. But obviously there's lots of complexities with that. And you've got all sorts of things with safe seats and party pre-selection, and there's a whole world of that to navigate. So I'd never say like, yes, it's going to happen, but if it came up, it's certainly something I pursue. Yeah,
amazing. And the reason that you cited for why you do it is exactly why we'd want you there as well, I think, for community as distinct from for ego. So I loved your answer. Look, we are knocking right on 1:30. Does anyone else have any other questions that they'd like to ask? Looking around, I know not everyone's. Oh, Chloe?
Yeah, sure. I'll check over a couple. My two questions were, are you part of a political party now, or are you independent?
So I am a member of the Labor Party and my local Labor branch here in Bassendean, yeah.
Cool. My second question was, when you were campaigning, especially the second time, was there any particular sort of community engagement activities that you found had the sort of the biggest effect, or you kind of got like the best sort of, not the best response, but sort of what kind of activities when you were campaigning, I guess, you felt had sort of the greatest opportunity to really meet people where they were and talk about the issues that they care about and kind of like present your kind of side of things. I think there's kind of a lot of different ways that you can engage with the community in a campaign. They're all a lot for me. I don't know what to kind of, where the best kind of to target is.
Yeah, so I'd love to be able to say that after the election I could quantify sort of action and outcome in terms of votes, but it's all very, very difficult to sort of follow. I think social media was a really important part. I think it's a really important part of modern election campaigns, having a Facebook page and even being sort of active on those like local community Facebook groups. I found just sort of being able to respond to questions and showing interest and that sort of thing, I feel had an impact in people feeling like, one, I was across sort of the stuff that they were asking, and two, that I was actually someone who was listening and taking in that information. Other things as well, like when there was events and stuff to go to. So we had a Meet the Candidates night, which was super important to get along to, because the people who rock up to a Meet the Candidates night to scope out their prospective councillors are the people who tend to go out into the rest of the community and talk about the people who were standing up. And even though it's a room of, 15, 20 people, those people tend to have their own sort of influence networks. And if you can make a good impression there, again, very hard to quantify definitively, but I imagine that also has quite a big impact. And just being present, I think, is the biggest thing, making sure that people see you at things, and not just in the campaign either, but really embedding yourself in the community. If you're going to run in 2 years, or you're going to run in a year, being present well before you actually put your hand up, so that people, do recognize you as part of the community, and it doesn't come across as opportunistic. People, you're sort of already embedded there, I think really, really helps.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks for the question, Chloe, as well. Look, I think in terms of, part of the training and the candidate training we do, social media is a big part of anyone's campaign, and a big part of social media, not just for your actual candidate campaign, it's also outreach to a lot of different community groups in your area. So whether that's to realize that you've got a community Facebook group in your area that has 5,500 followers, or 1,500 or 9,000 followers, and following those and embedding yourself in those, and seeing what the conversation's like and who the individuals are, and is a big part of that. So Chloe, you may have already done that in your area, but that outreach is, and it's like monitoring the local sustainability group, or the local parents climate action group, or the local what's on group. They're all really, really valuable to a future campaign, whether that's in a year's time or 5 years' time. So, but the time to follow them and join them is now, or yesterday, but otherwise now. Now I see there's a question from Sharon. So it's a question for both Emily and for us, and Carly's answered it there as well. So Sharon, Women for Election is a fully online training organisation. We went online in, as a contingency in COVID, and have never looked back changing it from that because of the accessibility. We will return to face-to-face events eventually, but at least at this point, it's all online. And Carly, I might get you to put our July equip training in the chat there, so that you can get some exposure to that as well, Sharon.
I'm already signed up for that. Thank you very much. Looking right. Forward to it.
So no branches at this stage, but don't seem to need to do branches at this stage either. Look, Emily, thank you so much. Is there any other questions? Sorry, I should do a quick scan. Oh, sorry, Andrew, you have a question?
Thanks, Lucia, and thanks, Emily, enormously. I'm just wondering what your experience is with local journalists, and how did you find the relationship there?
That's a really interesting question. So we seem to have a real lack of local journalists at the moment, which is probably a blessing and a curse in some ways. But yeah, it was nothing that really came up in a Bassendean context, which was surprising, because you're always expecting there to be some sort of influence from that. But I think there's been some restructures of some of our local papers, and sort of some of that local journalism sort of tapered off a bit as a result.
So do you get coverage now as a councillor? Are you leveraging the media to assist in community engagement, or it's been gutted in your area?
Seems like it's been gutted more or less. Every so often something, yeah, look, it is a real shame, and it seems that the things that do make the paper tends to be the really controversial decisions, and but not so much the the spotlight on the really good day-to-day stuff which is happening, which is a real shame.
Thanks.
That's a good question, Andrew, and it's not an unusual answer that we hear, particularly from alumni that we've trained in WA and SA and Queensland in terms of the local newspapers. I'm noticing that trend, particularly in those states. From Tessa, how did the Equip course help you? I promise that's not a Dorothy Dixer.
Yeah, so I did the course after I'd already been elected to council, so I'd sort of stumbled through my own election process, just sort of working it out on the go, and then afterwards I thought, right, well, I'd love to, you know, if I do want to take a political career further, I'd love to have a bit of a more solid framework for how that looks, because doing it in such a haphazard way at a local level worked, but felt very clumsy, and if it was ever going to be anything more, then you know, having that wonderful advice would be very much appreciated. But it definitely helped in terms of having that confidence to say, well, this is why I'm running, and this is what I'm doing, and being able to shape that messaging, I think has been a really, really useful part of the course as well. One of the things that we did in the course was 25-word pitches, I think it was, or some very short distillation of, you know, what are you running for? What do you want to do? And I think it's a really useful skill to have, not just in campaigning, but even as an elected member, because you're talking to people who want to know what you're doing, but they don't want to read 75 pages of an officer's report to understand it. They want to know, we're building this for this, and this is how it's going to, you know, make our community better. So that was some really useful stuff that came out of that course.
Thanks, Tessa. And then I think we've got one more question from Ruth. And thanks for the shout out to Emily, I should say. You were already elected when you did it.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks for being the change we're seeking to see. You know our style, Licia and I, and I'm wondering if you could give us some specific ways we can support trans candidates as allies, something we're very intentional about. We try and do that with our language, our lanyards, our brochures, whatever. But do you have any other, like just those subtle bits of support we can do to say, I see you, we're here for you, even though we're cis white normies? How can we help trans and non-binary candidates?
Yeah, look, I think, so what sort of led me to the organisation in the first place was the queer scholarship that you have. Mm-hmm. And that was something which, when I saw it, I was like, wow, that's really great, because I think in a lot of women's sort of political groups, a lot of trans people go into that with a lot of apprehension. You know, you don't know where those lines are, and if you're going to be sort of included in those groups. So I think there's a real hesitation to proactively engage with some of those supports, and those supports actually, you know, have that really clear messaging of, you know, we are here for you, we include you in our definition, and this is for you as well. So I think really strongly inclusive branding. I think the biggest thing in terms of inclusion for me is that if there's no explicit sign of support, it's assumed unsafe. And that tends to be the sort of golden rule, I guess. And that's something that, you know, in my youth work is a big thing with our services, is, you know, any service which isn't explicitly safe is unsafe. There's no middle ground, I guess, because you don't want to be putting yourself into that space and then finding out after the fact that it actually wasn't particularly safe, because that's an even worse experience than just not reaching out at all. So I think what Women for Election does already in terms of that really inclusive stuff, having those scholarships, having you know, holding interviews like this as well, it's a really good start, and just sort of saying, you know, everyone's welcome here and everyone can engage with this sort of material.
Thank you, Ruth. And yes, we do try to be intentional, but cis white normies, thanks, Ruth, we always are learning as well, and we'll always continue to learn. So it's great to hear how we can be more intentional. So thanks. Look, thank you again, Emily. We're up to the time where I said we would keep you to. I know you've got a crazy busy week leading into end of financial year, and your work and your councillor work. So if everyone could join me in thanking Emily for today and for giving up her time. Thank you so much. And we really do wish you all the best in your political journey. It's only in its infancy, I'm pretty sure, and we look forward to staying in touch as well.
Thank you so much for having me today. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, and keep doing great things by your community. And thank you everyone for your time as well. And yes, we do have queer scholarships to our courses. So if you would like to, either the link was put in the chat, promote that to your network, our next July training, and promote the fact that it's the Australian Marriage Equality Foundation who provide scholarship tickets to our training, then please promote. We'd always be grateful. There are not enough people across the country that know we exist, and we need your help to do that. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great rest of the week.